Welcome back to Money Matters. I'm Emily Johnson, joined by David Crowell. We've been discussing the potential tax reform, specifically the House reform, and a very interesting editorial from Bloomberg as sort of our kickoff point. And I think where we were leading when we hit the half was discussing how these various plans would potentially impact you and your pocketbook and some of the different aspects. And I know before the show started, we were talking about tax planning, and that's something that most people do, or a lot of people do, going into year end, looking at, have I paid my full amount of taxes? Am I going to need to pay more taxes? If I'm a business owner, do I bonus myself? I'm a business owner, or if I'm an employee with a 401k plan, do I max that out? What can I do by year end to maximize my tax position, or minimize my tax position, I guess is a better way to put it.
Yes, exactly.
But it is very difficult to do that in this environment when we look at 2017 is pretty much a known unless they make any of these things retroactive. So 2017 is a known. So 2018 is our big unknown, but there are very few things that you can actually do from a tax planning standpoint right now as you look at 2018 to see if you're putting yourself in a better spot. And a few that I've seen referenced in similar articles, all also opinions, are for business owners to go ahead and max out 401ks at the full profit sharing level, which is $54,000 if they can, due to cash flow, because not sure what that's going to look like, if it's going to be a pre-tax deduction or an after-tax deduction in 2018. So that's one. Of course, accelerating expenses, because we're not sure which expenses are actually going to be deductions in 2018. So I know health was one of them that would phase out the, and a few other, mortgage interest potentially could only be deducted up to $500,000 versus $1 million.
Versus $1 million right now.
Which that makes a big difference for quite a few people. Now, granted, that is, of course, that is impacting.
And for primary residences only,
right?
Which would impact Columbia, South Carolina, almost not at all, because its single-family residences top out in the $500,000–600,000 range.
Right.
And it has a base of primary residences largely. It would impact Hilton Head, because all real estate, as we've said many times, is local. It would impact Hilton Head enormously, because most of our properties are initially, at least, second homes and investment properties.
There is an argument, though, against diminishing returns on that. I mean, if you have individuals that are wealthy enough to own individual homes that are in the $700,000, $800,000, and presumably then their primary home is probably also similar, the deduction makes a difference, yes, but there is diminishing returns for them at some point. I mean, yes, it is deducted up to $1 million, but chances are the income is there to support it. I think, isn't there some curve that supports that I don't remember?
Absolutely. One of the compensating changes that's being discussed is the eradication of the alternative minimum tax. That same person who owns an $800,000 primary and an $800,000 secondary and three new expensive cars and a bunch of nice stuff suffers from the alternative minimum tax. Anyone earning, not a tax accountant, but anybody earning over about $125,000, $130,000 begins to bump into the alternative minimum tax.
And anybody out in Silicon Valley who has options. And those are, of course, they're extremely against this plan, which they have been all along, but they don't mention the fact that one of the big things that they don't like is that their options are going to be taxed differently now.
They're going to be taxed.
Because they're the only ones that are really left with options, pretty much, anymore.
That's right. So,
generalization.
Tax law is the fundamental resting place. I think I said last week that really taxation and the manipulation of taxation is the core function of government. It's the one thing. Government doesn't do much very well, but they sure as heck tax well. And local taxes, state taxes, county taxes.
What's their ultimate power? It's the power that they hold.
It's the power of the purse. It's the power they have.
They've held it forever.
And so
back to biblical times, it was the power.
That's exactly right. And so they. It's an agglomeration of lobbying efforts from throughout history. It's a carbuncled, oddball, endlessly complex body of law,
but it's
which
also
will only become more so as the lobbyists have at it.
Well, theoretically, it's also supposed to motivate certain behaviors, right? That's supposed to be,
Right.
for example, it's supposed to motivate small business upstarts. It's supposed to motivate investment in small business. In theory, these are the things that are supposed to happen. It's supposed to motivate large corporations to bring funds back into the United States and start circulating them. It's supposed to do all of these things. There is supposed to be for every action there should be a reaction. There's supposed to be a motivation behind each of these that should generate additional growth, additional gains, additional jobs. That's in theory what we're trying to stimulate, or what the Congress is trying to stimulate through these taxes. Now, the parties that they're trying to appease is, of course, what's at question, and who's going to get hurt more and who's going to get hurt less, and all of that. And the proof's in the pudding. But in theory, it's supposed to be motivating growth that should have broad appeal. That's the objective.
It's supposed to. This is, however, the golden age and flowering of capitalism. The major corporations are, for the most part, outside the law, outside the constraints of government, outside certainly the constraints of taxation. The major corporations run our elections. They run our House of Representatives and our Senate through lobbying. They are the government. When Tim, what's his name from Apple?
Cook?
Tim Cook from Apple can go on television and say, why, yeah, in answer to a question, why, yes, we have at Apple $350 billion sitting in cash offshore, which we have strategically placed there because of the existing tax law.
Sure, well, you've had all these mergers and acquisitions overseas for just that purpose.
What he's saying outright, and the person questioning him didn't have the chutzpah to say it to him, you are willfully, with your phalanx of tax attorneys, being a bad citizen as it sits. In other words, do you really need a change in the tax law in order to get you to be a good corporate citizen?
Well, but the argument against that is...
the answer is, he should be embarrassed. He should be thrown off the stage.
Well, but by the same, because he has shareholders that he has to answer to first. Now, I know, I get that.
The ultimate refuge of bad behavior is, the shareholders.
Right. And of course, on a personal level, he's vehemently against the tax reform, except when it comes to Apple stock price and what it's going to do to Apple stock price, which of course means he's going to benefit from it, while at the same time he can at least grandstand and say, I don't agree with various aspects of this. It's going to hurt the little people, but it's going to make my stock price go like this, which is going to help me just a little bit, even if I end up getting taxed more. And that is actually another thing.
That sums up the problem.
It does. Conflicting interests. But we always call high taxes it's a high class problem to have. Mm-hmm. If you end up having to move from a 35% tax bracket to a 39% tax bracket, nobody likes that. Mm-hmm. But as a percentage, it goes up. As an actual dollar amount in your pocket, if you're earning those extra funds that actually shift you into that bracket, presumably you're benefiting from the other 70% that's there, whatever, 60% that's there, and presumably that amount is also higher. So it's a nice problem to have. Trying to manage it so that you can keep most of it in your pocket is, of course, the objective. But there are some things that you just can't do, and so at least legally, and so they're trying to manage that. But it is that whole, do you serve, which God do you serve? Do you serve the God of the shareholders, or do you serve the God of the U.S. public and as a good citizen,
as a good corporate citizen? This corporate citizenship business is not just hoo-ha. It's not just a fun thing to say. It has become important and vital to our nation's stability now that the corporations are as powerful as they are.
Right, and
it just is a fact that they kind of run the show. So we really are beholden to them to be responsible about it.
But when you look at the number, and I completely agree, and you look at the number of jobs that are covered, et cetera, but when you look at the number of people that are actually invested in the equity markets, it's a pretty small number relative to the population. And getting smaller among younger generations. Millennials are less likely to invest. So at some point we could have a European-style uprising of the millennials and younger. And
who just say, the heck with all of you guys.
Right, that could very well happen, because there's less and less real interest in
real investment in the broader economy for economic reasons, because of the concentration of wealth and poverty, and because of lack of
when this wonderful run we've had in the markets for the last several years, it's not that 100% of the U.S. population has benefited from that.
No, about 25%.
Right, 25%. Now, granted, they should be rewarded for that, for actually taking the time to save and have that discipline. However, sometimes it's just not in the cards when your fixed costs exceed it.
Talked not nearly long enough about
probably long enough for your happiness and health.
About tax reform. This is Money Matters. Emily Johnson, David Crowell. We'll see you next week.